Some promises outlive the people who make them, binding strangers together in ways neither could have imagined. Sometimes the life you've been running from finds you anyway, even in the most remote corner of the world. Caleb Mercer has lived alone in the Montana mountains for 15 years, far from people and their complications. When his uncle dies and leaves him a cabin, he thinks nothing will change. Then Sarah Brennan arrives at his door with an old letter and a stunning claim. She was promised to his uncle 20 years ago, and now that promise falls to him. Neither wants this. Both are too stubborn to walk away. In a place where winter is unforgiving and survival depends on trust, two people must decide what matters more, the life they planned or the one they never saw coming. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The knife felt heavier than it should have. Caleb turned it over in his hands, watching autumn sunlight catch the worn blade. His uncle's hunting knife, the one that had gutted 1,000 elk, carved initials into aspens, and once, according to family legend, saved Ezra's life in a bar fight in Butte. The handle was smooth antler, polished by decades of use until it fit a man's grip like it had grown there. Now it was Caleb's, along with everything else. He stood on the porch of the cabin that was no longer his uncle's but his own, though it didn't feel that way yet. Maybe it never would. The structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, their trunks straight as rifle barrels, their needles whispering secrets in the breeze. Behind the cabin, the land rose steadily toward the peaks, granite faces that turned pink at dawn and purple at dusk. A creek ran 50 yards down slope, cold and clear, full of cutthroat trout that weren't stupid enough to bite a hook unless you knew their ways. Caleb had learned those ways from Ezra. He'd learned most of what mattered from the old man, how to read weather and the wind, how to move through timber without snapping twigs, how to be still enough that deer walked past within arm's reach, how to be alone without being lonely, though Caleb suspected he'd failed that last lesson somewhere along the way. 15 years he'd been up here. 15 years since he'd walked away from everything, the noise, the crowds, the expectations that pressed down like stones on a man's chest. He'd been 32 then, just back from his second tour, with a head full of things he couldn't talk about and a future that felt like a trap. Ezra had taken one look at him and said, "You got the mountain sickness, boy. Only cure is mountains." So Caleb had come. He'd built his own cabin 3 miles north of Ezra's place, close enough to check on the old man, far enough to preserve the solitude they both craved. They'd seen each other once a week, sometimes less, in winter. They'd shared meals and silence, whiskey and wisdom. Ezra never pushed, never pried into what Caleb had left behind. He simply showed him how to live in this hard, beautiful place where a man's worth was measured in his competence and his word. Now Ezra was gone. Heart attack, the doctor in town said. Quick and clean, the way the old man would have wanted it. He'd been 78, still splitting his own wood, still checking his trap lines. One morning he'd simply sat down in his chair and not gotten up. His neighbor, old Tom Brenner from 5 miles east, had found him 3 days later when he'd come by for their usual chess game. The funeral had been small, a dozen mountain folk, hard people with soft hearts, who'd known Ezra for decades. The preacher from town who'd made the ride up even though Ezra hadn't set foot in a church since 1952. And Caleb, who'd stood dry-eyed through the service because the tears were stuck somewhere behind his ribs, too heavy to rise. Afterward, the lawyer had pulled him aside. Young fellow couldn't have been more than 30, wearing a suit that looked ridiculous in the mountain dirt. He'd handed Caleb an envelope. "Your uncle's will was straightforward. Everything goes to you, the cabin, the land, his personal effects. 40 acres, legally registered. No debts, no complications." No complications. Caleb almost laughed at that now. He'd spent the last 2 weeks sorting through Ezra's belongings, a task that felt like archaeology. Each object told a story he was only beginning to understand. There were books, their spines cracked from reading, on everything from forestry to philosophy. There were tools maintained with religious care, each one cleaned and oiled after every use. There were photographs in a tin box, images of people Caleb didn't recognize, places he'd never been. And there were letters, dozens of them bundled in faded ribbon dating back 50 years. Love letters, Caleb realized with surprise. His uncle, the confirmed bachelor, the man who'd told him once that a wife was like a good horse. You treated her right and she'd serve you well, but most men didn't know how to do the treating part. Had been in love. The letters were from someone named Marianne, written in elegant script that spoke of longing and distance, of promises made and circumstances that kept them apart. Caleb had read only a few before it felt too much like trespassing, but they'd changed something in how he saw his uncle. The loneliness he'd always assumed was choice now looked more like consequence. Ezra hadn't rejected love. He'd lost it and never found it again. The hunting knife gleamed in Caleb's palm. On the handle, carved so small you had to look close, were two sets of initials, E.M. and M.B. Ezra Mercer and Marianne somebody. A promise made permanent in antler bone. "Sentimental old fool," Caleb murmured, but there was affection in it. He slipped the knife into the sheath on his belt where it settled with comfortable weight. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. This was Caleb's favorite time of day, when the world softened and the sharp edges of life blurred into something bearable. The temperature would drop fast once the sun disappeared. Autumn nights in the high country had teeth. He needed to bring in more firewood, check the small barn where he kept his mule and the 2 goats he'd inherited, along with everything else. He needed to figure out what to do with this place. Keep it seemed the obvious answer, but it meant maintaining 2 properties, and winters were hard enough with one. Sell it felt like betrayal, though Ezra hadn't put conditions on the inheritance. The old man had simply left Caleb everything and trusted him to do right by it. Trust. That's what it came down to. Ezra had trusted him with his legacy, just as he'd trusted him with the mountain wisdom, the survival skills, the quiet understanding that some men needed space more than they needed companionship. Caleb walked to the edge of the clearing where the land dropped away, offering a view of the valley below. The trees were beginning their autumn transformation, aspens turning gold among the evergreens, creating patterns that shifted in the wind. Somewhere down there was the town of Red Creek, population 200 and declining, where he went 4 times a year for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself, where people still nodded hello but had learned not to expect conversation. That was his world, this mountain, this solitude, this life he'd carved out where the only expectations were the ones he placed on himself. It had been enough for 15 years. Some days he even believed it would be enough forever. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Winter was 6 weeks away, maybe 8 if they were lucky. Caleb turned back toward the cabin, mentally cataloging what needed doing before the first real storm hit. The roof needed checking, the chimney cleaning, the root cellar stocking. Normal preparations, comforting in their routine. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow everything would change, that a woman would appear on this same porch, carrying a letter that would upend every assumption he'd made about his uncle, his inheritance, and his carefully protected solitude. That the quiet life he'd built would be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. But tonight, he was just a man standing in the fading light, his uncle's knife on his belt, facing another evening alone in the mountains he'd chosen over everything else. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, there was firewood to split and a simple supper to make, and that was enough. That had always been enough. Until it wasn't. The knock came at dawn, sharp and insistent against wood that rarely heard a human hand. Caleb was already awake, had been for an hour, standing at the stove with coffee brewing and the first light just beginning to soften the darkness outside. The sound startled him more than it should have. Visitors didn't just appear in these mountains. You saw them coming from a mile away, heard their horses or their trucks laboring up the rough trail, but he'd heard nothing. Whoever was out there had either come on foot or arrived in the night. He moved to the door with the caution that 15 years of solitude had bred into him, one hand instinctively checking the rifle mounted above the frame. Through the small window, he could make out a figure on the porch. Slight, wrapped in a heavy coat, a single bag at their feet. A woman, he realized. Young, or young enough. Her breath formed clouds in the cold morning air. Caleb opened the door halfway, keeping his body in the gap. "You lost?" She looked up at him, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. Pale skin touched with cold, dark hair, pulled back severe and practical, eyes the color of creek water, gray-green and clear. There was determination in those eyes, and something else. Desperation, maybe, though she was working hard to hide it. "I'm looking for Ezra Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady, educated, not mountain folk. "Ezra's dead, passed 2 weeks ago." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, then calculation, then something that might have been grief. "I see." She was quiet for a moment, and Caleb noticed she was shivering despite the heavy coat. "Then I'm looking for his heir. That would be you?" "Might be. Depends on what you're looking for." She reached into her coat pocket, and Caleb tensed until he saw it was just paper she was pulling out. An envelope, old and yellowed, protected in what looked like a plastic sleeve. She held it out to him. "My name is Sarah Brennan. This letter was written by Ezra Mercer to my grandmother 20 years ago. It's a promise, Mr. Mercer. A binding promise that brings me here." Caleb didn't take the letter. "I don't know what kind of promise you're talking about, but whatever business you had with my uncle died with him. I'm sorry for your trouble, but you've wasted a trip." "I haven't wasted anything." Her voice sharpened, the desperation showing through now. "That letter is a legal document. It promises land rights and security to my grandmother and her descendants. She died last year. I'm her only living heir, which means the promise falls to me and the obligation falls to you." "The hell it does." Caleb started to close the door, but she put her hand against it. Not pushing, just holding, her palm flat against the worn wood. "Please, just read it. That's all I'm asking." There was something in her voice, beneath the determination and the educated diction, that made him pause. A rawness he recognized because he'd heard it in his own voice once. A long time ago, the sound of someone who had nowhere else to go. Against his better judgment, he took the letter. The envelope was addressed in a careful hand. To Marianne Brennan and her descendants, a promise made in faith and honor. The postmark was faded but readable. Red Creek, Montana, 1995. 20 years ago, just like she'd said. Caleb pulled out the letter inside. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind a man used when he wanted his words to last. Ezra's handwriting, no doubt about that. The same script he'd seen in the books and notes scattered throughout the cabin. "Dear Marianne," it began, and Caleb felt that strange discomfort again, the sense of trespassing on something private. But he read on. "By the time you receive this, if you ever do, years will have passed. Perhaps you've married, built the life you deserved, but that I could not give you. Perhaps you've children, grandchildren even, and this letter will seem like the ramblings of an old fool, too stubborn to let go of what might have been. But I made you a promise, Marianne, and I keep my promises, even when life makes keeping them look different than I imagined. The 40 acres adjacent to my property, the land we once spoke of building a home on together, is yours. I've kept it in trust all these years. If you come, it's yours. If you send your descendants, it's theirs. Along with it comes my word of protection, provision, and partnership in the way of the frontier. You know what that means. You know what I'm offering, clumsy as it is. If you come, or if your blood comes in your stead, I will honor the old ways. Marriage, if that's fitting. Security, always. A share in everything I've built. I loved you, Marianne. I love you still. That never changed, even when everything else did. This is my way of proving it. Yours in faith, Ezra Mercer. Below the signature was a legal addendum, properly notarized, citing territorial law and land rights that Caleb barely understood. But the intent was clear enough. Ezra had promised this woman, or her descendants, a share of his land and his life. Caleb looked up at Sarah Brennan, who was watching him with those clear, desperate eyes. This is insane. You can't just show up 20 years later and claim, I can. She pulled out another document, this one newer. I've had lawyers look at it. Territorial law still applies in certain cases, especially regarding land grants and marriage contracts. The promise is legally binding. Your uncle offered partnership, which in the context of frontier law means marriage or equivalent legal union, tied to land rights. I'm here to accept. You're here to accept. Caleb heard his voice rise, felt anger mixing with disbelief. Lady, I don't know what you think this is, but I'm not marrying some stranger because my uncle wrote a love letter 20 years ago. I don't want to marry you. Her voice was flat now, exhausted. I don't want to marry anyone. But I need this land, Mr. Mercer. I need the security it represents. I've got nowhere else to go, nothing else left. My grandmother kept this letter her whole life, told me about it before she died. Said if things ever got desperate, this promise would hold. Things got desperate. She met his eyes, and he saw the truth there. Whatever had brought her to this mountain, it wasn't some romantic notion or easy money. It was survival, pure and simple. I can work, she continued. I know how to cook, clean, mend, manage a household. I am not useless. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for what was promised, land rights and security. If that means a paper marriage, fine. We don't have to like each other. We don't even have to speak to each other if you prefer. But I'm not leaving. Caleb stared at her, this impossible woman with her impossible claim, standing on his porch in the freezing dawn like she had every right to be there. Part of him wanted to shut the door, ignore her until she got cold enough to leave. But another part, the part that had been raised to honor his word and respect his uncle's, couldn't quite dismiss her. Let me see that other document, he said finally. She handed it over. Legal paper, dense with language he'd need a lawyer to fully pass. But certain phrases stood out. Binding under territorial statute. Land rights transferable to heirs. Partnership contract enforceable. I need time to think about this, Caleb said. Get a lawyer to look at it proper. The nearest lawyer is in Red Creek. That's a 4-hour ride in good weather. I made it in 6 and there's snow coming. She glanced at the sky, which was indeed taking on that heavy gray quality that meant a storm. I can wait outside if you prefer, but I'm not leaving this property. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that came from work, not leisure. Her hands, when she'd held out the documents, had been rough, calloused. Her coat was worn but well-maintained, patched in places with careful stitches. Everything about her spoke of someone who'd known hardship and dealt with it through competence. She reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself. There's a shed around back, he said finally. It's got a stove and a cot. Used to be a bunkhouse when Ezra had help during logging season. You can stay there while I figure this out, but I'm not promising anything beyond a roof for a few days. Relief flooded her face, quick and unguarded, before she locked it down again. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I might still send you packing once I know what I'm dealing with. You won't. She picked up her bag. Just one, he noticed, small enough to carry everything she owned. Because your uncle made a promise, And I think you're the kind of man who honors that, even when it's inconvenient." She was right, damn her. That was exactly the kind of man he was, the kind Ezra had taught him to be. Honor your word, respect your debts, take care of what's yours. The code wasn't complicated, but it was absolute. He stepped aside, let her into the cabin long enough to warm up while he built a fire in the shed stove. She stood near his own fire, not touching anything, just absorbing heat like it was a luxury she'd been without for too long. "How'd you get here?" he asked, pulling on his coat. "Bus to Red Creek. Then I hired someone to bring me up the mountain road as far as it goes, walked the last 5 miles. In the dark. I had a flashlight, and your uncle's directions were very specific." She pulled out the letter again, and Caleb saw there were additional pages. A hand-drawn map, detailed instructions. Ezra had been thorough, at least. "Give me 10 minutes to get the shed ready." When he came back, she was looking at the photographs on Ezra's mantle, the ones Caleb hadn't had the heart to take down yet. Her attention was fixed on one in particular, an old daguerreotype in an ornate frame. A young woman, beautiful, with dark hair and serious eyes. "That's her," Sarah said softly. "My grandmother. Marianne." Caleb moved closer, studying the photograph he'd looked at 100 times without really seeing. Now, with Sarah Brennan standing next to him, he saw the resemblance. The same eyes, the same determined set to the mouth. "She was 16 in that picture," Sarah continued. "Ezra was 18. They met at a dance in Red Creek. Her father was the banker. His father was a mountain guide. Wrong class, wrong circumstances. Her father made her marry someone else, someone appropriate, but she never forgot Ezra. And he never forgot her." She turned to Caleb, and her voice was gentle now, stripped of defensiveness. "I know this is strange. I know it's not what you wanted, but they loved each other their whole lives, Mr. Mercer. This promise was his way of taking care of her, even after everything that kept them apart. I'm just trying to honor that, and maybe, in honoring it, find something for myself." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. The whole situation was impossible, insane, something that belonged in a different century, when promises carried the weight of law and marriage was as much about survival as love. But looking at that old photograph, at his uncle's careful handwriting, at this woman who'd walked 5 miles in the dark because she had nowhere else to go, he couldn't quite bring himself to send her away. Not yet, anyway. "Shed's ready," he said gruffly. "There's blankets and a water pump outside. I'll bring food after I've had time to think." "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "It's Caleb. If you're going to be on my property, at least call me by my name." "Caleb, then. I'm Sarah." He nodded, not trusting himself to say more, and watched as she picked up her single bag and walked out into the cold morning. Through the window, he saw her make her way to the shed, her shoulders straight despite obvious exhaustion. Then he turned back to the letter, the legal document, and the photograph of a woman his uncle had loved his entire life. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. The storm Sarah had predicted, coming right on schedule. Caleb had the distinct feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just walked into his carefully ordered life. And unlike the weather, he had no idea how to prepare for it. The chess set became their evening ritual. After dinner, after the dishes were washed and the day's work was done, they'd sit across from each other with the carved pieces between them and play until the fire burned low. The set was beautiful in its simplicity. Each piece carved from different woods, elk antler for the kings and queens, all of it polished smooth by generations of hands. Caleb's father had made it during a winter when illness kept him bedridden. Each piece a small victory over boredom and pain. He'd given it to Ezra, who'd treasured it, used it to teach Caleb not just chess, but patience, strategy, the value of thinking 3 moves ahead. Now it was teaching him something else, how to be with another person, how to share space and silence without it being awkward or forced. They talked during the games, conversations that meandered like the creek below the cabin, finding their own path through the landscape of two lives. "Tell me about the army," Sarah said one night, moving her knight to threaten his bishop. Caleb considered both the board and the question. "What do you want to know? What you did? Why you left? Why you ended up here instead of anywhere else?" He moved his bishop to safety, bought himself time. "I was infantry, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Saw things, did things." He stopped, the words catching. "I came back different. Angry, mostly. At everything, everyone. Couldn't sleep, couldn't hold still. Everything felt wrong, like I was wearing someone else's skin." "PTSD," Sarah said quietly. "That's what the doctors called it. I called it the mountain sickness after what Ezra said. The sense that I needed space, needed quiet, needed to be somewhere big enough to hold everything I was feeling without it spilling over onto other people. Did it work? Coming here?" He moved his rook, thinking. "Mostly. The nightmares got less frequent. The anger settled into something I could manage. I learned to be alone without it eating me alive." He looked up at her. "What about you? What are you running from?" "Running toward," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "There's a difference. Tell me." She captured his rook with her knight, studied the board. "My stepfather is a mean drunk. Not violent exactly, but cruel. The kind of man who uses words like weapons, finds your soft spots and presses until you break. I left as soon as I could, but poverty has its own kind of cruelty. Working 3 jobs, never getting ahead, watching other people build lives while you're just trying to survive. You could have stayed in Nevada, found something better." "Could I?" She met his eyes. "I tried for 12 years, Caleb. Every opportunity led nowhere. Every door closed just as I reached it. At some point, you realize the game is rigged, and staying just means losing slower." She moved her queen. "Check," he blocked with his knight. "So you came here?" "I came here because my grandmother's dying words were that this promise would hold, that Ezra Mercer kept his word even when life didn't keep its promises to him. I came here because I was desperate enough to bet everything on a letter written before I was born." She paused. "I came here because I wanted something real, even if it was hard, especially if it was hard. Easy things have never worked out for me." Caleb studied her across the board, this woman who'd walked into his life carrying nothing but determinations and her grandmother's memories. She was different than he'd first thought. Not just capable, but complex, layered with experiences that had taught her resilience without breaking her entirely. "We should probably talk about what happens next," he said. "Practical things. Like marriage. Like whether marriage is what we really need or if there's another way to honor the promise." Sarah moved her bishop, setting up an attack he saw 3 moves ahead. "The lawyer's document says partnership with land rights. In frontier law, that meant marriage or equivalent legal union. We could try to find an equivalent, but—" She gestured around them. "We're snowed in for at least another month. And even when the trail's clear, do you really want lawyers picking apart what we're trying to build here?" "No," he admitted, "but I also don't want you to feel trapped. Marriage it should mean something. It does mean something. It means commitment, partnership, mutual support. It doesn't have to mean love, at least not right away." She captured his knight. "Checkmate in 4 moves, by the way." He looked at the board, saw she was right. "You could have just won. Where's the fun in that? Besides, I wanted to finish the conversation first." He smiled, despite himself. "You're a strange woman, Sarah Brennan." "I'll take that as a compliment. So, marriage. What are you really worried about?" Caleb leaned back, the question hitting deeper than he'd expected. "That I can't be what you need. That I'll fail you the same way I failed." He stopped, surprised by what had almost come out. The same way you failed what? Sarah's voice was gentle. No pressure, just invitation. My unit. My men. There was a patrol, an ambush. I made a call that cost lives. That's why I left. Not just the PTSD, but the knowledge that when it mattered most, I got it wrong. The silence between them was different now, weighted with truth he rarely spoke. Sarah didn't rush to fill it with platitudes or reassurances. She just sat, holding space for his confession. That's why I live alone, he continued. Out here, my decisions only affect me. I can't let anyone down if there's no one counting on me. Except now there's me. Except now there's you. Sarah reached across the board, her hand stopping just short of his. Caleb, I'm not your unit. I'm not a mission or a responsibility you can fail. I'm a partner, or at least I want to be. That means we make decisions together, carry weight together. If something goes wrong, it's on both of us. That's not how it works in my head. Then maybe it's time to rewire your head. She pulled her hand back, smiled slightly. Look, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be present, to work with me, build with me, figure this out as we go. That's all partnership is. Two imperfect people choosing to face life together instead of alone. He wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe he could be that person, the one who shared burdens instead of carrying them solo. The army had taught him to lead, to protect, to take responsibility for everything and everyone. But maybe that's not what was needed here. Maybe what Sarah needed was an equal, not a protector. There's something else, Sarah said, pulling him from his thoughts. I should tell you before we make any decisions. Go on. I can't have children. Medical issue from when I was younger. I know that matters to some men, legacy and all that. If it matters to you, I need to know now. Caleb processed this, the unexpected relief that came with it. It doesn't matter. I never planned on having kids anyway. This life, he gestured around. It's not exactly child-friendly. No, she agreed. But it could be partnership-friendly, if we're both willing. The next day they rode down to Red Creek together. The storm had finally broken, leaving the world crystalline and bright. The trail was dangerous with ice, but Caleb knew every switchback, every place where the path narrowed to inches. In town, they caused a stir. People knew Ezra had died, knew Caleb had inherited. But seeing him ride in with a woman, both of them serious and purposeful, sparked immediate speculation. Old Tom Brenner flagged them down outside the general store. Caleb, Miss. He tipped his hat to Sarah, curiosity plain on his weathered face. Tom, this is Sarah Brennan. She's... Caleb hesitated, unsure how to explain. I'm here to claim a promise made to my grandmother, Sarah said directly. Ezra Mercer's promise. I have legal documentation if anyone questions it. Tom's expression shifted from curiosity to understanding. Marianne's granddaughter, I'll be damned. She always said Ezra would keep his word, even from the grave. You knew her. Knew them both. Watched that whole sad story play out over decades. If you're here to claim what's yours, you'll find support in this town. Ezra had a lot of respect around here, and anyone who honors his promises honors him. They made their way to the lawyer's office, a cramped room above the barber shop. The same young lawyer who'd handled Ezra's will looked at Sarah's documents with professional attention. This is legitimate, he said finally. Under territorial statute still, applicable in certain cases. The promise is binding, the land rights are clear. If you accept the terms, Miss Brennan, Mr. Mercer here is obligated to honor them. And if we want to formalize it, Caleb asked, marriage would satisfy the partnership requirement most cleanly. I can arrange that. Judges in town today. But I should warn you. He looked uncomfortable. There are parties interested in mineral rights in this area. If they catch wind of a disputed claim, they might challenge the legitimacy of the inheritance or the promise. A formal marriage would shut down most of those challenges. Sarah and Caleb exchanged glances. Neither of them had mentioned the actual reason she was here, but small towns had sharp ears. Someone had been asking questions, apparently. "Who's interested?" Caleb asked. "Marcus Dalton, mostly. He's been buying up properties all through the valley. Some folks are happy to sell, others less so. He hasn't made an offer on Ezra's place yet, but it's only a matter of time." "Tell him it's not for sale," Caleb said flatly. "Will do. Now, about this marriage." Caleb looked at Sarah, the question unspoken but clear. She nodded, barely, but it was enough. "Set it up," Caleb said. "We'll do it proper." An hour later, they stood before the town judge, a woman in her 60s who'd known Ezra and seemed genuinely pleased by the turn of events. The ceremony was brief, practical, witnessed by the lawyer and old Tom, who'd insisted on being present. "Do you, Caleb Mercer, take Sarah Brennan as your lawful wife, to honor and protect in the way of these mountains and the promises that bind us?" "I do." "And do you, Sarah Brennan, take Caleb Mercer as your lawful husband, to honor and support in the way of these mountains and the promises that bind us?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you married. May you build something worth keeping." They signed the certificate, accepted congratulations that felt surreal, and walked out into the cold afternoon as husband and wife. Legal now, official, bound by more than just Ezra's promise. On the ride back, Sarah said, "That wasn't how I imagined getting married." "Did you imagine it?" "Sometimes. White dress, church, people who cared. The fairy tale version." She smiled slightly. "But this feels more honest somehow. We're building something from scratch. No illusions about what we're signing up for." "No illusions," Caleb agreed, though he wondered if that was entirely true. Some part of him was already imagining more than partnership, more than practical arrangement. Some part of him was starting to hope this could become real in all the ways that mattered. The cabin appeared through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney they'd banked before leaving. Home, Caleb thought, and meant it differently than he had before. Not just his home, but theirs. That simple shift in pronoun carried more weight than the marriage certificate folded in his pocket. They were in this together now, for better or worse. Time would tell which one it turned out to be. Winter deepened, and with it, their understanding of each other. They were married on paper, but the real partnership was something they built daily through small acts and shared silences. Sarah reorganized the cabin with quiet efficiency, not changing Ezra's place, but making it function better. Curtains appeared on windows, herbs dried on racks she'd rigged near the stove, supplies were inventoried and rotated so nothing spoiled. Caleb found himself watching her work, appreciating the competence, the lack of fuss. She never asked permission, just saw what needed doing and did it. And somehow, the cabin began to feel less like a memorial to his uncle and more like a living space, warm and purposeful. One morning, he woke to find fresh bread cooling on the counter. Real bread, not the dense bannock he usually made. The smell alone was worth more than he could say. "Where'd you learn to bake?" he asked when she came in from checking the chicken coop they'd built together the week before. "Trial and error, mostly. Stole a cookbook from the library when I was 16, practiced until I could make something edible." She poured them both coffee. "I can teach you if you want." "I'd like that." They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, her hands guiding his through kneading dough, explaining gluten development and proof times with the patience of someone who taught herself and understood the struggle. When the second loaf came out of the oven, golden and perfect, Caleb felt an absurd pride in it. "We're a good team," Sarah said, breaking off a piece of warm bread and offering it to him. He took it, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch lasted a moment longer than necessary, neither of them pulling away immediately. Then Sarah turned back to the dishes, and the moment passed, but something about it lingered. The next day, Caleb took her to the overlook, the one he'd mentioned before but hadn't actually shown her. It required a 2-hour hike through deep snow, following a trail he knew more by instinct than markers. Sarah kept pace without complaint, her breath forming clouds in the crystalline air. When they broke through the tree line, the view opened before them. Valley floor 3,000 feet below, mountains marching to the horizon in every direction, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. The wind was sharp here, unimpeded, but Sarah just tightened her scarf and stood taking it in. "This is why," Caleb said, gesturing to encompass everything. "Why I stay, why I can't imagine being anywhere else." "It's magnificent," Sarah breathed, "like standing at the edge of forever." They sat on a flat rock that the wind had swept clear of snow. Caleb pulled out the thermos of coffee they'd brought, poured them each a cup. For a while, they just sat in companionable silence, watching the way light moved across the distant peaks. Then Caleb reached into his pocket, pulled out something small wrapped in paper. "I found this yesterday, pressed in one of Ezra's books. Thought you should have it." Sarah unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a wildflower, perfectly preserved, its petals still holding faint color despite decades of pressure. It was a columbine, Colorado's flower, though they grew in Montana too at the right elevation. Delicate, beautiful, impossibly fragile. "There's an inscription on the paper," Caleb said. Sarah turned it over, read the faded pencil. "For Marianne, from our place." "E." Her hand trembled slightly. "He picked this for her." "From this spot, I'd guess. Ezra told me once that he'd brought a woman here, long time ago, said it was the most honest place he knew, where you couldn't lie because the world was too big to hide from yourself." "Thank you for bringing me here," Sarah said quietly. "For sharing this. It's your place too now. All of this is." He hesitated, then continued. "I know we're doing this backward. Married first, getting to know each other after. But I want you to know I'm glad you came. Glad you're here. You've made this place feel—" He searched for words. "Less like hiding and more like living." Sarah looked at him, something shifting in her expression. "Can I be honest about something?" "Always." "I'm scared. Not of you, or this place, or the life we're building, but of wanting it too much, of letting myself hope this could be more than just practical arrangement." She looked down at the pressed flower. "My grandmother loved your uncle her whole life. Married someone else, had a family, built a life. But she never stopped loving Ezra. I heard it in her voice every time she mentioned him. That kind of love. It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. Beautiful because it endures. Terrible because it can hurt forever. You think we could have that? I think we could have something. I don't know what yet. But I feel myself starting to care, starting to want—" She stopped, shook her head. "I'm not explaining this well." Caleb took a breath, decided to match her honesty. "I dream about you sometimes. Not nightmares, which is what I'm used to, just dreams. We're working together, or sitting by the fire, or walking through snow. Normal things. But I wake up and I'm smiling, which hasn't happened in 15 years. So if you're scared of wanting too much, you're not alone in that." She turned to him fully then, and he saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. The space between them felt charged, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. "If we're going to do this," Sarah said carefully, "if we're going to let this be something real, we need to promise to be honest. No pretending, no protecting each other from hard truths. Just honesty. I can promise that. Even when it's difficult. Especially then." She nodded, seemed to come to some decision. Then she leaned forward, slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted. He didn't. Their lips met, cold from the wind but warm underneath, tentative and genuine. It lasted only a moment, but when they pulled apart, something had fundamentally changed. "Was that honest?" Sarah asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Very," Caleb replied, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. They sat together as the sun tracked across the sky, not talking much, just existing in this new space they'd created. The pressed flower lay between them on the rock, a reminder that love could endure impossible circumstances, that promises had power, that sometimes the best things came from unexpected places. When they finally hiked back down, the light was golden, the world softening into evening. They held hands on the trail, partly for safety on the icy sections, partly because they wanted to. Neither acknowledged it, but both understood what it meant. That night, dinner was easy, conversation flowing like it always did over their evening chess game. But there was a new current underneath it, an awareness that hadn't been there before. They were married, yes, but now they were choosing it actively, with full knowledge of what they were building. When Sarah went upstairs to her room, Caleb stayed by the fire, the pressed flower on the table beside him. Ezra had loved Marianne from this same cabin, across decades and impossible distance. Now their grandchildren, well, nephew and granddaughter, were finding something of their own in the same place. The symmetry of it felt like blessing and responsibility at the same time. They had a chance to finish what Ezra and Marianne couldn't, to prove that promises kept could lead somewhere good. Caleb touched the flower gently, then placed it back in the book where Ezra had kept it. Some things were meant to be preserved, held safe against time. Some promises were meant to bloom, even 50 years late. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and pine. Inside, something new was growing, fragile as a wildflower, but rooted in honest ground. Whether it would survive the winter remained to be seen, but at least they were tending it together, and that felt like enough to start with. More than enough, actually. It felt like hope. The lawyer arrived on horseback 3 weeks later, his city suit looking even more absurd, covered in trail dust. His face was grim as Caleb led him inside, where Sarah was preparing lunch. She took one look at the man's expression and set down her knife. "What's wrong?" she asked. The lawyer, his name was Mitchell, pulled a folder from his saddlebag with the care of someone handling explosives. "I need you both to sit down." They sat at the table, the lunch forgotten. Mitchell spread papers between them, official documents with seals and signatures. At the top of one was a surveyor's map, detailed and technical, showing property lines and geographical features. "After your marriage was filed," Mitchell began, "it triggered a review of the property records. Standard procedure when ownership transfers or partnership is established." He pointed to a section of the map. "This is Ezra's 40 acres, but this—" His finger moved to an adjacent area. "This is the parcel referenced in his promise to Marianne, technically separate, though they share a border." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "What does this mean?" "It means the original promise was more complex than the letter suggested. Ezra didn't just offer to share his land. He'd filed a separate claim on adjacent property specifically for Marianne. It's been held in a trust, waiting for her or her heirs to claim it." Mitchell pulled out another document, this one older, dated 1975. It showed mineral surveys, geological assessments, technical language that Caleb struggled to parse. But one phrase jumped out. "Significant rare earth deposits confirmed." "What am I looking at?" Caleb asked, his voice flat. "A geological survey from 50 years ago. The property Ezra claimed, the one promised to Marianne, sits on top of a substantial rare earth mineral deposit. These minerals are used in electronics, renewable energy technology, defense applications. Their worth—" Mitchell paused, clearly uncomfortable. "Current market estimates put the deposit's value at somewhere between $15 and $20 million. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah had gone very still, her face unreadable. Caleb felt something cold settling in his chest. "Let me be clear," Mitchell continued. "This survey was done before Ezra made his promise. He knew what was under that land when he put it in trust for Marianne. He also knew that under territorial law, mineral rights stay with the original claim holder unless explicitly sold. Which means Sarah has legal right to half that property," Caleb finished, "regardless of our marriage." "Precisely. The marriage satisfies the partnership aspect of the promise, but the land claim and mineral rights exist independently. Miss Brennan, Mrs. Mercer, could claim the property, sell the mineral rights, and walk away with generational wealth. The marriage wouldn't change that." Sarah still hadn't spoken. Her hands were flat on the table, white-knuckled. Caleb looked at her, trying to read her expression, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "There's more," Mitchell said, clearly wanting to get through all the bad news at once. "Marcus Dalton has filed a legal challenge. He claims that Ezra's original filing was improper, that the claim should have reverted to open territory decades ago. He's demanding the land go to auction, where he intends to purchase it." "On what grounds?" Caleb demanded. "He's arguing that the trust arrangement was invalid because Marianne never formally accepted it during her lifetime, that it can't transfer to heirs without explicit documentation showing she acknowledged the claim. Honestly, it's a weak argument. But Dalton has money and lawyers, and he knows how to delay things, make them expensive and complicated. Can he win? Unlikely. Your marriage provides documentation of acceptance. Sarah's presence here, your joint filing of the marriage certificate referencing the promise, it all supports the legitimacy of the claim, but proving it will take time. And Dalton knows that time equals pressure. The longer this drags out, the more tempting his settlement offer becomes." "What settlement offer?" Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice oddly distant. Mitchell pulled out another paper. "He's offering $5 million, cash, for immediate sale of all mineral rights and a quit claim on the property. It's a fraction of what the deposit is actually worth, but it's guaranteed money. No legal battles, no uncertainty." The number hung in the air like a physical thing. $5 million. Enough to change a life. Multiple lives. Enough that Sarah would never have to struggle again, never have to depend on anyone or anything. Enough that she wouldn't need this marriage, this mountain, or Caleb. "I need to think," Sarah said abruptly, standing. I need some air." She grabbed her coat and walked out, not quite slamming the door, but closing it with enough force to make the point. Caleb watched her through the window, saw her walk toward the tree line, her shoulders tight. "I shouldn't have sprung it on her like that," Mitchell said apologetically. "But you both needed to know. Dalton's lawyers are pushing for a response by next month." "She didn't know," Caleb said quietly, "about the minerals, the value. She came here because she needed security, not because she was chasing money. I believe you, but now that she does know—" Mitchell left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. After Mitchell left, Caleb sat alone with the documents spread before him, feeling something ugly coil in his chest. Sarah had seemed genuine, had worked beside him, shared stories and silences, kissed him on that overlook with what felt like real feeling. But maybe he'd been a fool. Maybe the whole thing had been about the land all along, and she was just better at playing the long game than he'd given her credit for. He remembered the ring she'd shown him, the story about wanting something real. Had that been manipulation? A way to make him lower his guard, trust her, marry her so she could claim what was hers and disappear? The thought made him sick, but he couldn't shake it. 15 years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that he'd been played. When Sarah came back an hour later, her face was blotchy from cold and possibly tears. She stood in the doorway, looked at him across the room, and seemed to read everything in his expression. "You think I knew," she said. "Not a question," Did you? No. Her voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. I knew there was land. I knew there was a promise. I didn't know about minerals or millions of dollars or any of this. She gestured at the papers still on the table. I came here because I was desperate and alone, and my grandmother said this would be safe. That's all. But now you do know. And now you have options you didn't have before. Yes. She didn't try to deny it. I have options. The silence between them was different than before. Sharp, painful, full of doubt instead of possibility. What are you going to do? Caleb asked. Sarah pulled something from her pocket. The survey document, Caleb realized. She must have taken it outside with her. Without a word, she walked to the stove and opened the door. The fire inside blazed hot and bright. Don't, Caleb said, but she'd already dropped the paper into the flames. They watched it curl and blacken, the technical drawings and geological assessments turning to ash in seconds. There, Sarah said, her voice shaking. No more proof, no more easy path to wealth. Just what we have here, what we're building. That was stupid, Caleb said, anger rising. That was your security, your future. No, she interrupted, turning to face him. This is my future. You are my future. If you'll still have me after knowing I could walk away rich and chose not to. Mitchell has copies. Dalton has copies. Burning one document doesn't change anything. It changes that I chose. I chose this, Caleb. I chose you. Not because I have to, not because I'm desperate or have no other options, but because in the last month I've been happier than I've been in my entire life. Because I wake up every morning glad to be here. Because when I imagine my future, it's here, with you, building something that matters more than money. Caleb wanted to believe her. Wanted it so badly it hurt. But trust was hard won and easily shattered, and right now he felt like he was standing on broken glass. How do I know you mean that? He asked quietly. How do I know this isn't just you playing a longer game, making yourself look noble while you figure out what serves you best? The hurt that crossed her face was immediate and deep. You don't, she said finally. I can't prove it any more than you can prove you're not just using me to secure the land claim against Dalton. Trust works both ways, Caleb. Either we have it or we don't. So where does that leave us? Sarah pulled off her wedding ring, her mother's ring that she'd started wearing after their ceremony, and set it on the table. It leaves us here. I'm not leaving this property. The promise is legal and binding, marriage or not. But I won't stay married to someone who thinks I'm lying about why I'm here. So you decide. Either you trust what we've built, or you don't. Either you believe I chose you over money, or you don't. She walked upstairs, and Caleb heard the bedroom door close. Not slam, just close, leaving him alone with the ring, the remaining documents, and the wreckage of what had been just hours ago. Something that felt like it might become love. He picked up the ring, felt its worn smoothness, thought about everything Sarah had told him about her mother, her grandmother, her life of struggling and surviving. Thought about the way she'd fit into this place, into his life, like she'd been meant for it all along. Then he thought about $5 million, about how that kind of money changed people, about whether anyone could really choose a hard life in the mountains over generational wealth. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering everything in white. Inside, Caleb sat with his doubts and his fears, trying to decide whether love, or whatever this was between them, was worth the risk of being wrong. Whether trust could be rebuilt once doubt had entered, or if this was the beginning of the end they'd both feared from the start. The ring caught firelight, gleaming softly. Upstairs, silence. And somewhere in Red Creek, Marcus Dalton was probably already planning his next move, counting on human nature to do what legal pressure couldn't, drive them apart and leave the land vulnerable. Caleb put the ring in his pocket and stared into the fire, searching for answers that wouldn't come. Not tonight. Possibly not ever. All he knew was that tomorrow they'd have to face each other again, decide whether the foundation they'd built could withstand this earthquake, or if it had been built on sand all along. The fire crackled, indifferent to human troubles. The mountain didn't care about promises or money or broken trust. It just endured, ancient and patient, waiting to see what fragile human bonds could survive its test. Right now, Caleb didn't know the answer. And that uncertainty felt like the loneliest thing of all. They didn't speak for 2 days. They worked because the mountain demanded it, because survival required cooperation. But the silence between them was thick with hurt and doubt. Sarah cooked. Caleb chopped wood. They passed each other in the cabin like ghosts, careful not to touch, careful not to meet eyes. On the third morning, Caleb woke to find the kitchen empty, the fire cold. Sarah's coat was gone from its hook. He felt immediate panic, followed by anger at himself for caring. But he pulled on his boots and went looking anyway. He found her at the overlook, sitting in the same spot where they'd kissed, where she'd received the pressed flower. Her face was tear-streaked but determined, and when she heard him approach, she didn't turn away. "I've been thinking," she said without preamble, "about trust and proof and what we owe each other." Caleb waited, the cold seeping through his coat. "You're right to doubt me," Sarah continued. "I would too in your position. Money changes things, and 5 million is enough to make anyone question anyone else's motives." She pulled out a folded paper. "So I went down to Red Creek yesterday. Filed these." She handed him the documents. Legal forms. Dense, with language. But the meaning was clear. Sarah had formally disclaimed any right to the mineral deposits, had put it in writing, notarized and filed, that she had no claim to the wealth beneath the land. All mineral rights reverted to Caleb, as Ezra's heir. "You can't just," Caleb started. "I can, and I did. The land itself remains in joint ownership per the promise, but everything under it, yours. Dalton can challenge all he wants, but this makes it clear I'm not here for money." "Sarah, let me finish." Her voice was firm. "I also found something in Ezra's journal. Additional pages I'd missed before, stuck in the back. He left instructions, for you specifically, about what to do if Dalton ever came calling." She pulled out photocopies of journal pages, Ezra's handwriting immediately recognizable. Caleb read them standing there in the wind, his hands shaking slightly. "If you're reading this, Caleb, things have gotten complicated. Probably Dalton's involved. The man's had his eye on this land for years, ever since he heard rumors of what's beneath it. Don't trust him, don't negotiate with him, and whatever you do, protect what's yours. There's a cache hidden on the property. Old mining office documents from when the territorial claim was first filed. Original surveys, sealed with the territorial government stamp. They prove the claim was proper, the trust was legal, and any challenge Dalton makes is groundless. The cache is at the old line shack, 3 miles northeast of the cabin. Behind the stove, under the loose floorboard, marked with an X. Get those documents before Dalton's men find them. They're your insurance, and maybe your only defense if things turn ugly. Take care of Marianne's girl if she comes. I know you'll do right by her. You're a better man than I was. You actually finish what you start." Caleb looked up at Sarah, something shifting in his chest. "You found these yesterday?" "After I filed my disclaimers. I rode back up, spent the night going through every page of that journal. Found these in the last section, where the binding was coming loose." She met his eyes. "We need to get those documents before Dalton does. Mitchell said he has a month to respond to the challenge, but what if Dalton doesn't wait? What if he's already looking?" "The line shack." Caleb calculated distances, conditions. "That's a hard ride in winter. 6 hours round trip, maybe more with snow. So we leave now. Together. Something in the way she said it, together, broke through the ice that had formed around his heart. She'd given up millions, had worked to protect what was his, was ready to ride into danger to secure documents that would defend his claim more than hers. And she was asking him to trust her, to work with her, to be partners in the way they'd promised to be. Caleb pulled the ring from his pocket, the one she'd left on the table 3 days ago. He held it out to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have trusted. What we built. Should have believed you when you said you chose this, chose me. I let fear and doubt win. And that was wrong." Sarah took the ring, her hand trembling. "I understand why you doubted, and I'm not asking you to trust blindly, but I am asking you to trust evidence. Look at what I've done, not just what I've said. Does it look like someone chasing money?" "No," he admitted. "It looks like someone building a home." She slipped the ring back on her finger, and something in Caleb's chest loosened. "Then let's go protect it. Together." They prepared quickly. Supplies for a day's ride, weapons in case of trouble, warm gear against the dropping temperature. Caleb pulled down Ezra's rifle from above the door, the Winchester his uncle had maintained with religious care. He'd learned to shoot with this rifle, had hunted with it, knew its weight and balance like his own hands. "Can you shoot?" he asked Sarah. "You've seen me shoot? I mean really shoot. If it comes to it." "If it comes to it? Yes." Her voice was steady. "I won't let Dalton steal what's ours." Ours. The pronoun hit him harder than it should have. They were in this together now, truly. Not just legally married, but actively choosing each other, choosing to fight for what they were building. They rode out as the sun climbed toward noon, following trails Caleb knew but that were treacherous with ice and hidden obstacles. The line shack was old, barely standing, a remnant from when Ezra had worked timber claims in the area. They'd taken shelter there once, during Sarah's first week, but Caleb hadn't thought about it since. Now he wondered if Dalton knew about it, if men were already there, searching for what Ezra had hidden. The ride took longer than expected. Snow had drifted across the trail in places, forcing detours. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through sections too dangerous to ride. But they kept moving, driven by urgency and shared purpose. When they finally reached the shack, it looked undisturbed. Snow piled against the door, no tracks visible. But Caleb approached carefully anyway, rifle ready, Sarah close behind with her own weapon. He pushed open the door slowly, checking corners, looking for signs of intrusion. Empty. Cold. The stove stood where it always had, rusted and decrepit. Caleb moved to it, started shifting it aside. The cast iron was heavy, but between them they managed to move it enough to expose the floor underneath. There, boards marked with a faint X, barely visible unless you knew to look. Caleb pried them up, his heart hammering. Below was a metal box, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. "Got it," he said, relief flooding through him. That's when they heard the horses. Caleb and Sarah froze, exchanging one quick look. Then they were moving. Caleb grabbed the box. Sarah pushed the boards back into place. They slipped out the back of the shack just as voices reached them from the front. "Has to be here somewhere." Old man was careful, but he left clues. Marcus Dalton's voice, cultured and cold. Caleb risked a glance around the corner of the shack. 4 men, well armed, spreading out to search. Dalton himself stood by the door, expensive coat making him look absurdly out of place in the mountain wilderness. "Check inside, every inch. Those documents are our ticket to the whole claim, but only if we find them before Mercer does." Caleb pulled back, met Sarah's eyes. They were trapped. Their horses were tied on the other side of the shack, visible from where Dalton stood. and the men were already entering the building, would discover the disturbed floor any moment. Sarah pointed toward the tree line 30 yards away, but across open ground. It was a risk, but staying was certain discovery. Caleb nodded. They ran. Not quietly. Speed mattered more than stealth now. Behind them, shouts erupted. There! 2 of them, Mercer and the woman. Stop! That property is under legal dispute. You're interfering with... Whatever legal justification Dalton tried to claim was lost as Caleb and Sarah hit the trees. Branches whipped at them, snow grabbed at their boots, but they kept moving, the metal box clutched against Caleb's chest. Behind them, pursuit. Men crashing through brush, voices calling to each other. But Caleb knew these mountains like he knew his own heartbeat. He led Sarah down a slope, across a frozen creek, up an embankment that was steep enough to slow their pursuers. "Where are we going?" Sarah gasped. "Old Hunting Blind. 1/4 mile from here. We can defend it if we need to." They reached it as the sun started its descent, a natural formation of rocks that created a partial shelter, positioned to watch game trails, but defensible if necessary. Caleb pulled Sarah into the cover, both of them breathing hard. "They'll have our horses," Sarah said. "I know, but they don't know this area like I do. We can walk out after dark, hit the main trail below where they'll be watching." "That's a 10-mile walk in the dark. In winter. You got a better idea?" She shook her head, managed a slight smile despite the circumstances. "At least we got the documents." Caleb opened the box, pulled out the oilcloth package. Inside, exactly as Ezra had promised, original land surveys, territorial seals intact, documentation that proved every aspect of the claim was legitimate. With these, Dalton's challenge would collapse. "Your uncle was thorough," Sarah said, looking at the papers. "He was protecting what mattered." Caleb looked at her. "Same as we're doing now." They waited as darkness fell, heard Dalton's men searching, gradually moving away as the cold and approaching night drove them back toward town. When full darkness came, Caleb and Sarah began the long walk home, staying off trails, moving by starlight and instinct. It was brutal. The temperature dropped below 0, wind cutting through their coats. Sarah stumbled repeatedly, and Caleb caught her each time, kept her moving. They shared body heat when they stopped to rest, shared the last of their water, shared the determination that they would make it because giving up meant losing everything. Near dawn, frozen and exhausted, they stumbled into the cabin. Caleb built up the fire while Sarah collapsed into a chair, too tired to even remove her coat. He made coffee, strong and hot, and they sat together as warmth slowly returned to their limbs. "We need to get these to Mitchell," Sarah said finally. "Soon as we can. Tomorrow. Today we rest." Caleb looked at her, face pale with exhaustion, eyes showing the strain of what they'd been through. "You could have stayed back. Let me go alone." "No," she said simply. "I couldn't. We're partners, remember? That means facing danger together." Caleb reached across, took her hand. It was cold still, but when she squeezed back, he felt the strength in it. "I trust you," he said. "I should have said it 3 days ago, but I'm saying it now. I trust you, Sarah. With this land, with this life, with everything." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I trust you too, and whatever comes next, we face it together." Outside, dawn was breaking, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Inside, 2 people sat by the fire, hands clasped, having fought for their future and won. The documents that would defeat Dalton's challenge lay on the table between them, proof not just of legal right, but of promises kept, of courage shared, of partnership forged in adversity. They had work ahead still. Legal battles, winter to survive, a life to build from complicated beginnings. But sitting there in the early light, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Certainty. Certainty that he was exactly where he should be, with exactly who he should be with. The mountain had tested them, they'd passed, and whatever else came, they'd face it the same way, together, honest, unbreakable. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 3 weeks passed in tense waiting. Dalton filed his appeal as expected, and Mitchell filed counter motions. Legal papers flew back and forth while Caleb and Sarah tried to maintain normal life. They worked the land, prepared for spring, acted as though the threat hanging over them didn't exist. But it colored everything, this uncertainty about their future. Then, on a clear March morning, Dalton himself arrived at the cabin. Caleb saw him coming from a distance. Expensive truck struggling up the rough trail, completely unsuited for mountain roads. He called to Sarah, and they met Dalton together on the porch, a united front. Dalton climbed out of the truck, looking windblown and irritated. Whatever polish he'd had in the courtroom was gone, replaced by frustration and something that might have been desperation. "I want to talk," he said without preamble. "Just talk. No lawyers, no recording, just 3 people trying to find a solution." "We're not selling," Caleb said. "I know, I figured that out." Dalton looked between them, seemed to come to some decision. "Can we at least sit down? I've driven 4 hours to get here." Against his better judgment, Caleb nodded toward the porch chairs. They sat, Dalton in one, Caleb and Sarah sharing the bench, still presenting unity. The morning sun warmed the wood, and somewhere in the trees, a bird called out with the particular joy of early spring. "I'm going to be honest with you," Dalton began. "More honest than I've been with anyone in a long time. I need those mineral rights, not want, need. I've leveraged everything I have on the assumption I could acquire them, property, investments, loans. If I don't secure this claim, I'm ruined. Completely." "That sounds like a personal problem," Sarah said, her voice level. "It is. But it's also a practical reality that affects all of us. I have 6 months before the banks come calling. If I can't produce results by then, I'll lose everything, which means I'll have nothing to lose. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Sounds like a threat," Caleb said. "It's a warning. Because if I go down, I'm taking options with me that you might wish you'd considered. Legal battles you didn't want. Complications that will make your lives miserable, even if you eventually win." Sarah leaned forward. "Why should we care about your financial problems? You've done nothing but make our lives difficult since the moment you learned about this property." "Because—" Dalton stopped, seemed to struggle with something. "Because I'm asking. Not demanding, not threatening, asking. What would it take for you to sell me just the mineral rights? Keep the land, keep your home, keep everything you actually use. But let me have what's underneath. Let me save myself." $5 million wasn't enough before, Caleb asked. "I'll give you 10, 12 if you need it. Literally everything I can scrape together. You'd never have to work again, could live wherever you want, do whatever you want." "We want to live here," Sarah said simply. "We want to keep what we have. Money doesn't change that." Dalton looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Everyone has a price. Everyone wants something." "We have what we want," Caleb said. "You can't buy that, because it's not for sale." Dalton stood, his frustration finally breaking through. "You're being fools. That money could give you security for life. Real security, not this." He gestured around at the cabin, the mountains, the life they'd built. "This is poverty with a pretty view. You're choosing hardship over wealth because of what? Principle? Sentiment?" "Because it's ours," Sarah said, standing to face him. "Because we built it together. Because some things matter more than money, even if you can't understand that." She pulled something from her pocket then, a locket Caleb had never seen before, tarnished, silver on a delicate chain. She opened it, showed Dalton what was inside. 2 photographs, sepia-toned and faded. On one side, a young Ezra, barely more than a boy. On the other, a young Marianne, beautiful and hopeful. "My grandmother kept this her entire life," Sarah said. "Wore it under her clothes where no one would see, where her husband wouldn't find it. She loved Ezra Mercer from the time she was 16 until the day she died at 83. 67 years of loving someone she couldn't have because her father chose money and status over her happiness." She closed the locket, held it tight. She told me once that her biggest regret wasn't losing Ezra. It was letting money make the choice for her. She said if she'd been brave enough to choose love over security, her whole life would have been different. Maybe harder, but hers. Sarah looked directly at Dalton. "I'm not making her mistake. I'm choosing what matters, even if it's harder. Especially because it's harder." Dalton stared at her, something shifting in his expression. For a moment, he looked almost human. Tired, defeated, but maybe understanding something he hadn't before. "Then I've wasted my time," he said finally. "Maybe," Caleb agreed. "Or maybe you've learned something worth more than mineral rights." Dalton walked back to his truck, paused with his hand on the door. "The appeal will proceed. My lawyers will fight as long as I can pay them. If there's any angle to challenge your claim, they'll find it. This isn't over." "We know," Sarah said, "but we're not afraid of you anymore. Fight all you want. We'll still be here when you're done." Dalton drove away, his expensive truck bouncing over the rough trail. Caleb and Sarah watched him go, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. "That was brave," Caleb said, showing him the locket. "It was true, and I'm tired of being afraid of the truth." She looked up at him. "My grandmother loved your uncle her whole life and never got to be with him. We have what they wanted and couldn't have. I'm not giving that up for anything." Caleb pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. "Neither am I." They stood there as morning warmed into afternoon, as the mountains stood witness to another small human drama playing out in their shadow. Dalton would fight, that much was certain, but he'd fight alone, with only money and lawyers. While Caleb and Sarah had each other, had the land, had a love built on honesty and shared struggle. In the end, that would make all the difference. The locket hung around Sarah's neck now, visible for the first time in decades. A promise kept across generations, a love story that had taken 50 years to find its ending. Not the ending Ezra and Marianne would have chosen, but an ending nonetheless. Their grandchildren, by blood and by choice, had claimed what they couldn't, had built what circumstances denied them. It was enough. It was everything, and no amount of money could buy what they'd found in this remote mountain cabin, in each other's company, in the simple act of choosing love over ease. The appeal would come. They'd fight it. They'd win or lose based on law and evidence and the particular wisdom of judges who'd never set foot in these mountains. But whatever the legal outcome, they'd already won what mattered most. Each other, this place, this life. The rest was just details. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. Snow retreated to the highest peaks, the creek swelled with meltwater, and the meadow below the cabin exploded with wildflowers, columbines and lupines and Indian paintbrush, creating a carpet of color that seemed impossible after months of white. The legal battle had taken 6 months to resolve. Dalton's appeal failed at the state level, his lawyers unable to find any angle that could overcome the territorial documents and the clear legitimacy of Ezra's claim. In the end, Judge Morrison's ruling stood. The land was theirs, free and clear, with no further challenges possible. Mitchell had called with the news on a Tuesday morning, and Caleb and Sarah had celebrated quietly. No grand gestures, just a long walk to the overlook, sitting together as the sun set, acknowledging that they were finally, truly safe. Now, 2 weeks later, Caleb was working on something he'd been planning since the appeal was decided. He stood in the barn, wood shavings curling at his feet, carving the final letters into a piece of seasoned pine. The sign was large enough to be visible from the trail, letters deep enough to last decades. It read simply, Mercer Brennan Ranch. Not just his name, but hers. Equal billing, equal partnership. The way it should be. Sarah came to find him as the afternoon light slanted through the barn door. She was showing now, 6 months pregnant with the child neither of them had planned, but both welcomed with quiet joy. Turned out Sarah had been wrong about not being able to have children, or the doctors had been wrong, or miracles happened sometimes in mountain air. Either way, she glowed with it, moved with the particular grace of women carrying new life. "Is that what I think it is?" she asked, running her hand over the carved letters. "Figured it was time we made it official," Caleb said. "This is as much your place as mine now. Should have both our names." She kissed him, slow and sweet. "Our place," she corrected. "And soon, our family's place." They hung the sign together that evening, mounting it on 2 sturdy posts at the head of the trail, where anyone approaching would see it. Stepping back, looking at their names carved in wood and bound together, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. A piece he hadn't known was missing. "Your uncle would approve," Sarah said, taking his hand. "He'd say it took me long enough to figure out what he knew all along." "What's that?" "That some promises are worth keeping, even when they're hard. Especially when they're hard." They walked back to the cabin as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Inside, they'd made changes over the winter. A room prepared for the baby, new curtains, shelves full of books they'd bought on their rare trips to town. Sarah had planted an herb garden near the door, was planning a larger vegetable patch for summer. The place was becoming theirs in ways that went beyond legal documents, was shaped by their presence and their plans. Old Tom came by later, bringing a hand-carved cradle he'd made for the baby. "My grandfather made one like this for me," he said, running his weathered hand over the smooth wood. "Figured the tradition should continue." They shared dinner. Venison stew, fresh bread, the companionship of people who understood the value of both speech and silence. Tom told stories about Ezra, about the early days when this part of Montana was truly wild, when promises were kept because a man's word was the only currency that mattered. "He'd be proud of you both," Tom said as he prepared to leave. "Making this work, standing up to Dalton, building something real. That's what this land needs, people who understand what it means to commit, to stay, to build across generations instead of just extracting and moving on." After he left, Caleb and Sarah sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. Sarah's hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby move. "What do you think they'll be like?" she asked. "Our child." "Strong," Caleb said. "Like their mother. Stubborn, definitely. Hopefully with your sense, and my—" He paused. "Actually, probably better if they get your sense." She laughed, the sound carrying across the clearing. "They'll be mountain-born. That means something." "It does. Means they'll understand what real wealth is. Not money, but land and sky and the freedom to build a life on your own terms." They sat in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge one by one. Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. Sarah's desperate arrival, the promise neither had asked for, the doubt and trust and fighting for what they were building. Thought about Ezra and Marianne, about love that endured despite everything, about promises kept across generations. "Do you ever wonder what they'd think?" Sarah asked, following his thoughts with the particular intuition that had developed between them. "Ezra and my grandmother, about us." "I think they'd be glad. That something good came from their heartbreak. That the promise Ezra made found its way to something real. I hope so." Sarah stood, stretched carefully. "Come on, it's getting cold, and your son or daughter is requesting dinner." Inside, they moved through evening routines that had become ritual. Sarah cooking while Caleb built up the fire, both of them existing in the easy companionship of people who'd chosen each other daily for almost a year. After dinner, they'd probably play chess or read, or just sit together talking about plans for summer, for the baby, for the years stretching ahead. It was an ordinary life in many ways, simple, quiet, built around survival and seasonal rhythms. But it was theirs, earned through honesty and struggle, built on a foundation of promises kept and trust earned. In a world that increasingly valued the easy over the meaningful, they'd chosen difficulty and found meaning in it. Outside, the sign bearing both their names stood at the head of the trail, announcing to anyone who came that this place was claimed, was loved, was defended. The Mercer Brennan Ranch. A testament to partnership, to family built by choice rather than just blood, to the idea that the best things in life were worth fighting for. Caleb pulled Sarah close, felt her relax against him, felt the slight movement of the baby between them. This was his family now. Not the one he'd been born to, but the one he'd chosen, the one that had chosen him back. It had started with a promise made decades ago by a man who loved too deeply and a woman who couldn't choose him. Had ended, or rather, was beginning with their grandchildren building what circumstances had denied them. The mountains stood eternal outside, indifferent to human drama, but somehow sanctifying it by their presence. Another spring would come, and another, and each one would find them here, working this land, raising this child, living this life they'd fought for. Some promises outlived the people who made them, binding strangers together in ways neither could have imagined. Sometimes the life you'd been running from found you anyway, even in the most remote corner of the world, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, what found you was exactly what you needed, even if you hadn't known to ask for it. Caleb had come to these mountains 15 years ago looking for escape. What he'd found instead was home, not in the place itself, but in the woman who'd walked into his life carrying her grandmother's memories and a promise she'd been brave enough to claim. That courage had changed everything, had taken them both from survival to living, from isolation to connection, from fear to love. It was a transformation neither had planned, but both had chosen, daily, with every small decision to stay, to try, to build something together. And that, in the end, was the greatest promise of all. Not the one Ezra had made to Marianne, but the one Caleb and Sarah made to each other every morning they woke up and chose this life, this partnership, this love. The fire crackled, the cabin glowed warm in the mountain darkness, and inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds, prepared for the next chapter of their story. A story that would continue, would grow, would be told someday to grandchildren sitting on this same porch, learning what it meant to keep promises and build lives worth living. The mountains didn't care about human stories, but they held them anyway, patient and eternal, bearing witness to all the small acts of courage that added up to love.